had a minor little epiphany the other day. I was watching Mark Steyn, John Robson, and Lindsay Shepherd testifying before the Justice Committee when I realized it's happening again. The debate about free speech in Canada. And I don't just mean the debate that we have, every 6 months or once a year or what have you, when there's somebody on campus who's giving some rather pretty basic and harmless speech and a bunch of SJWs and Antifa people show up and pull the fire alarm and riot and so forth, and we all say no, people should be free to, say anything aside from slander and libel and death threats and etc. I don't mean that. I mean the much bigger debate that we had a version of 10 years ago when Mark Steyn and Ezra Levant and others were before the human rights tribunals, and there were judges, courts, kangaroo courts, quasi-judicial bodies, politicians, parliamentarians weighing in on basically whether or not people should be punished for saying things that some people don't like, that other people deem hateful. It was a really interesting debate to be a part of a decade ago. To watch it all unfold, there were some great people putting forward some great arguments. It was a very energetic and exciting time. And the right side won. These Section 13 laws, which were deemed unpopular by a lot of people, not just conservative-minded people, but liberals and centrists, people really all across the board who basically believed in that idea that, well, I may not believe what you're having to say, I may not believe in the exact things you're saying, but I will fight for your right to say it. All of those people stood up, and they all stood up together. Andrew Lawton and I were talking about an event that he recalled being at a number of years ago, where Liberal Senator Jerry Grafstein stood beside Ezra Levant and others who, people who are generally not of the same opinion, and actually standing in the same room in the same event, talking about why free speech mattered. And I was a little disheartened when I had that realization just the other day that it's happening again. The debate is happening again. Because while it was a very vibrant time 10 years ago and why more or less the right side won, things are different now than they were 10 years ago. And there's a lot of people who just view the world and these issues very differently, and I don't think they're as open and as amenable to a lot of the great arguments we heard 10 years ago that we are today. Trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggressions, all those sorts of things. Those didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, they don't exist now. They're all just bizarre figments, but people very, very passionately hold on to them, and they're things that are out there in the activist square. That's the kind of stuff that the free speech warriors will be dealing with this time around. And I'm a little nervous. I'm not necessarily optimistic that things are going to prevail. We've got Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who for about a year now has really been harping on about how there's this awful stuff happening on the internet and we got to do something about it and so forth.
The platforms are failing their users, and they're failing our citizens. They have to step up in a major way to counter disinformation. And if they don't, we will hold them to account, and there will be meaningful financial consequences.
And you go, look, yes, there are increasingly people on social media who are just saying mean things and rude things and spewing their venom and so forth. Govern yourself accordingly, folks. Be polite, be well-mannered to others, articulate your opinions well and so forth. Take the high road rather than the low road, all that kind of stuff. But that's just up to us to be decent and respectful human beings. Do we need the government? Do we need the nanny state? Do we need Big Brother coming in and weighing all of that for us? Because ultimately that was what a lot of people felt those Section 13 hate speech laws actually were. And there were people who were actually involved in those human rights commissions, commissioners who did acknowledge that the net was cast too wide. This was not precisely defined terms like slander and libel and so forth and, death threats. This was other stuff. This was basically about policing people for their speech that you decided you hated. Hate speech should not just be speech that you hate. So 10 years later, here we are. The conversation is flaring up again. We're going to see the debate happen, and I think it's going to be different than it was 10 years ago. It's going to be different in some very interesting and troubling ways.